Anyways, today in the realm of mad science, it seems like a lot of you miss the old mad science locomotive videos. So we're gonna talk about 5 more today. Crazy experiments when engineers with unchecked potential or a lack of available resources do something to solve a problem. Or create a problem to be solved in some cases. And create truly mad inventions! The unchecked power of science knows no bounds! The Bousquet locomotive. Is it biscuit? Because it's French. It might be pronounced some way weird. And I keep wanting to call it biscuit. I'm just gonna call it biscuit, and it doesn't matter. No matter how I say it, someone's gonna be like, actually, it's pronounced, it's spelled like this, alright? You know what I'm talking about. Or maybe you don't, because this is a pretty obscure one. This is a French locomotive type. And it was an attempt at articulation, but this particular design was exceedingly unique to France. Very few were seen elsewhere, and while they quite liked them, at least for a while, no one else was really down with their particular strategy in terms of making this happen. This was as early as 1905, and that year, an engineer who worked for the Nord Railway, whose name was Bousquet, came up with this particular design, which is an articulated compound locomotive meant to haul heavier goods trains. This is because trains were getting longer and heavier, and the railroad was starting to have to double head. But that costs more, so they wanted to make a bigger engine, but the more size, the longer the wheelbase, and then you gotta worry about corners, so they had to make it articulated. It was a legitimate problem that needed a legitimate solution, and to be fair to the design, it did work, just not as well as other concepts. In their case, the boiler was fixed on a load-bearing frame, but supported by 2 articulated powered trucks, like a diesel. What? But this isn't a okay, their coal bins and the forward and rear water tanks, because these were tank engines, mind you, were carried on the frame, and their buffers and draw gear were also attached to said frame. And to be honest, the only reason they had those little wheels in the center was just to help support the weight of the cylinders, because as you notice, their cylinders were both inward, and went in opposite directions to drive their respective trucks. The rear truck on the engine were the high-pressure ones. The front truck had the lower-pressure cylinders, and received the steam from the rear truck via piping that had swiveling and telescopic connections to permit some movement. So they were slightly flexible, but not to a degree that it was a major problem. It was just something that he felt like they should have. And this whole moving the steam to the other low-pressure cylinders is nothing we haven't seen before. Meigs do the same thing. Pretty much every compound locomotive does it to some degree. That's what the whole design ethos is. You may have already noticed that also their water tanks were really long, going beyond the length of the boiler. And that was simply to increase the range, because these were meant to be mainline tank engines, so Bousquet wanted them to have extra water capacity. Putting both the cylinders in the center and reversing them was completely intentional, because that was meant to reduce the travel time between them, since, remember, you were moving the steam from the high pressure to the low pressure. With them being that close, it made that easier, so the piping was a lot less complicated. So Bousquet, to his credit, did a lot of logical work to make this as efficient as possible. The design was utilized in some other places in and around France, but as I said, weren't really popular anywhere else. A batch was sold to China, though it's unknown how well they did out there. Another batch was also sent to Spain to work on their 5-foot by 6-inch broad gauge, but apparently suffered pretty bad out there due to the steeply graded nature of the lines they worked. These engines just didn't have the power they needed, nor the endurance. The water capacity, despite being extended, was inadequate. And over time, other, more efficient ways of making an articulated steam locomotive were explored, and these fell out of favor. I don't think there are any survivors of this type either in the modern day, which is a shame, because they're pretty neat looking. One of the examples of a mad science experiment that, okay, yeah, it's a little nutso and weird, but it did work. The French liked it anyway. Balanced locomotives. What does that even mean? Are other locomotives imbalanced? Are these the only ones that have any balance? Do other locomotives just casually fall off the line willy-nilly? Well, no, not exactly. To explain the purpose behind all balanced locomotives pretty much, as there were numerous different designs attempted over the years, one key problem with conventional steam locomotives is that the movement of the pistons, the rods, the crossheads, and everything going back and forth causes all sorts of forces. These forces do affect the locomotive itself, not in a way that's so obvious necessarily depending on the size of the locomotive, but in some cases it can cause them to ride pretty rough, causing them to shake and rattle. Now, this problem can be mitigated by simply adding weights to the driving wheels, but those have the effect of upsetting the rotational balance, which causes the forces to result in an up and down force, which is known as a hammer blow, putting extra stresses on the track. If the forces are bad enough, the upward motion can actually lift the wheel up, and possibly throw the locomotive off the rails. So there's a very delicate balancing act, involving a lot of physics, that goes into making an effective steam locomotive that won't literally throw itself off the track. The idea of a balanced locomotive was to, well, remedy this by simply having two pistons on each side that would be set up in such a way as to cancel each other out. A good idea, but in practice, it was kind of a pain to do, especially when they were trying to do it. Most of the work that went into balanced locomotives all happened in the 1800s, back when these forces weren't quite as well understood and other solutions hadn't cropped up yet. So as a result, many of them look a little bizarre. The earliest known is the Birch balanced locomotive, which involves a patent granted to Richard Birch of Haywood in 1837. In his case, his was no. Each side of the locomotive would have an oscillating cylinder with two opposed pistons. This would result in the horizontal reaction forces being cancelled out, but not the vertical ones. And it's unlikely this was actually ever built, mostly because it's ridiculous. No, absolutely not. It's also arguable he didn't intend for this to be a balanced locomotive in the sense of what we're talking about, because he seems to have just wanted to employ the driving of both axles without the use of a connecting rod. Why he thought this was any better than that, I have no earthly clue, but, you know, here we are. In 1846, there was the Stephenson and Howe balanced locomotive. That one was legitimately meant to be a balancing fix. While most other engineers were using balance weights to cancel out these effects, George Stephenson decided he was going to use 3 horizontal cylinders placed in line across the locomotive, all connected to the single driving axle, because he was apparently a maniac. Granted, it did technically work. It reduced rolling and nosing, but it didn't give a constant drawbar pull. The 2 engines that were built to this design did have a good reputation as being great riders, but it still wasn't considered very effective or useful in the grand scheme of things, and at least one would be later converted to a normal engine within just a few years. Then in 1861, there was the Haswell duplex locomotive. Oh good. This design had 2 cylinders on each side, but angled differently so that both piston rods aligned in the center of the driving wheel. Okay. As strange as it looks, it did actually work. However, I suspect, due to the complicated nature of the construction here, no one opted to repeat the design. In 1881, there was the H.F. Shaw locomotive. This was a 4-cylinder balanced locomotive, which was literally named H.F. Shaw after the designer, so that was good. She was advertised as being completely free from the oscillating actions of a conventional 2-cylindered engine. And in her case, she had 2 cylinders on each side, but mounted beside each other, and they drove crank pins that were diametrically opposite of one another on the driving wheel, meaning that they canceled out each other's forces. And once again, this did work, as strange as it was, but also, once again, the design wasn't repeated. I think this keeps happening for, again, the same reason. Doing this way is just more expensive and harder to maintain. There was also a bit of a weirder one, known as the Woolwich Arsenal balanced locomotive, which was a 2-2-2-2, and is suspected to have been designed in the 1880s. On each side of this particular engine, there were a pair of cylinders that drove a single wheel, with the cranks at 180 degrees, because I don't know why they did that, actually. There's a lot of potential problems with this particular layout, I'm not gonna lie, and it's not even sure if she was ever built. Well, a patent was taken out on what was called a balanced duplex drive locomotive, because she would have been a duplex, yes, in 1885, and it said that one was built. She was supposed to be at the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich in the late 1880s, but there's no reference to an engine of her make or wheel arrangement ever having been at the Royal Arsenal Railway. So I don't know. It's one of those things. In 1896, we had the Strong balanced locomotive. Not saying she was strong necessarily, but that's because the designer was George Strong. She had 4 cylinders again, also, again, with the intention of canceling each other out, but set up in a way that's unlike pretty much anything we've seen before. In her case, there were 2 cylinders of 16 inches in diameter, and 2 cylinders of 28 inches of diameter, set up in, like that. Because, listen, I can't even deal with, but again, she did work, believe it or not. But also, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but to hear me out, the design wasn't repeated. Because, no, why would they do that when they could just put weights on the driving wheels, you know? We actually have a proper photo of this one, though she was abandoned by 1905. Which is a shame, because, I mean, she was definitely cool and unique. The West Air locomotives. I think that's how you say it. West. France! Why do you hate me anyway? This locomotive is not what you think it is, and I promise you that. Look at it. What is it? At first glance, maybe a diesel or an electric, but aha! Look at those side rods, and you say, oh, okay, it's a steam engine. No! You fools. You think I would give it away that easily? No. This very large engine, of which there were several built, was not a steam engine. They were compressed air locomotives. What? You might be saying, wait a minute, I thought that compressed air engines, which do have a place in the railroad industry and the history of railroading in general, are usually pretty small. And yes, they usually were, because they could only go so far, and they were mostly effective at working in areas where you wouldn't want a lot of smoke, or, yard shunters or something like that. But these were not meant for that. The intention here was to deal with a problem that the French West Network was dealing with in 1901. See, they had electrified their lines, and that was great, awesome. A lot of electric locomotives were running around. And that was at least partially because they couldn't use steam engines on a portion of the network because of, smoke issues. However, the concern was that what if one of those electric locomotives broke down because there was a problem with the electric, what if the power went out? We can't send a steam engine, and this was in 1900, so diesels weren't even a thing yet. What are we gonna do? Well, the answer was compressed air. They didn't produce exhaust. So the logic was they could use them to rescue stranded electrically pulled trains if the power went out. They were designed with 4-wheeled bogies, and again intended to serve as rescue locomotives. in case something bad happened with the electricity. But by 1910, they were replaced by electric locomotives, which... What? But I thought the whole point of the... Yes, but by that time, the power issues were largely no longer a thing. They didn't have to worry about the power going out quite as much. It was found that it really wasn't something that happened. They had built a reliable network. And it's also suspected that they may just not have been that great, because making a compressed air locomotive of this size was asking a lot. And, like, how far could they have gone? And how much power would they really have had, and for how long? There's a lot of questions here that don't really have much of an answer, because there's pretty limited information on how well they functioned. But I think the idea of them was good. It was a good concept, just it didn't really work out, based on what we know anyway. The caustic soda locomotives! The caustic soda. Caustic! What? Okay, yes, now we're getting into some real nonsense here. And sometimes they're just called soda locomotives, but I assure you they are not at all related to the delicious fizzy drink you may be enjoying right this second. No. These were a kind of fireless locomotive that did generate steam, but not in the way you'd think. In their case, they did raise steam in a boiler and expanded through the cylinders like a normal steam engine, but it was then condensed in a tank that contained caustic soda, otherwise known as sodium hydroxide. That tank surrounded the boiler, and if you were to dissolve water in said soda, heat is produced, and that generated even more steam from the boiler. It was actually kind of ingenious, and it basically meant that these kind of fireless locomotives could go for much longer than one that was just pumped full of steam. I mean, we have talked about firelesses that use steam, but they get their steam from a steam generator or another locomotive, and once they run out, they run out. In this instance, the soda allowed them to effectively recycle the steam for a larger amount of time, though not indefinitely. Eventually, the soda would become too diluted, and no longer release enough heat for it to make more steam, and they would stop. But they did last longer than typical firelesses. So, why didn't we see this more? It sounds pretty genius. Well, I'm just gonna remind you, of a simple word, that we utilized during this, during this story. Caustic! It's bad enough that normal steam locomotives, when they blow up, involve hot, scalding steam. And, you know, it's already kind of risky, so you gotta be careful and not do anything stupid. But, sodium hydroxide is nothing to play with. Like, it will burn you. It's called caustic for a reason. And I feel like most companies were like, okay, look, you know, we already know that there's a potential for accidents to happen, and, you know, if a steam locomotive explodes, it can cause some damage. Can we not just hurl horrific chemicals everywhere on top of it? Like, the scorching steam is bad enough. Do we have to horrid chemical burns, too? Like, it just wasn't really something people were super interested in risking. Also, they had to carry the caustic soda on board, and because of the design, that limited the size of the boiler, as well as how much water they could carry, because caustic soda on its own is heavy. You needed space, and there'd be more weight as a result of it being there. So it was just kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, so this is kind of a neat idea, but in practice, it's not really as good as other options, and also it could burn us horribly, and we're just gonna not. The Meigs Elevated Railway. What the heck is that? Behold! The Meigs Elevated Railway! Which is usually called a monorail. It ain't. It is not a monorail. I know it looks like it, but it's not. This thing had 3 rails, a design that was promoted by the designer, Josiah Vincent Meigs. Each of the cars had 2 bogies with 4 wheels, and were angled inwards to align with the rails. Each bogie also had a pair of horizontal gripper wheels between the two pairs of angled load-bearing wheels, which squeezed the center rail. And, okay, what? It was interesting, without question, and it was built as an experimental train, and despite being a steam engine technically, it was a cab-forward design, so there were a lot of ambitious ideas going into this, especially given it was 1886. It was kind of ahead of the time in certain categories, and much like a monorail, the train was meant to run on elevated trackage, so as not to take up as much space in the city, and also since it was steam, well, it wouldn't be releasing the exhausts on the ground. They would be up and away from people walking by. So, very forward-thinking. Very, very forward-thinking. However, it never came to be an actual commercial thing. Why not? Well, there were two main problems. For one thing, just a year after the test train was created in February of 1887, someone set it on fire. Yeah. The locomotive and the tender did survive, but not the rest of the train, and that set Meigs back quite a bit. But in addition to that, the other issue was Meigs himself. Meigs did not like electric traction. He wasn't a fan of it, and he was pushing for a steam-powered elevated monorail, hence why this was steam-powered. But everyone else saw a future in the electric trains, which wouldn't necessarily even need to be elevated, because, well, they wouldn't have any exhaust at all. Meigs hated that, and consistently pushed back, which alienated a ton of support for his design and investors. He never made any headway in this regard, and Boston would go on to have electric trains, as most places did, and Meigs' design was never repeated, which is a shame because he had the right idea. He was clearly smart, clearly had some good concepts, but he just couldn't accept the notion of electric traction, wanting it to be steam. But that meant that you had to elevate the line, and that was more expensive. So people just didn't take it up on him when there was another option that was not only cheaper but just as effective. I don't think anyone really sneers at electric trains. They were very successful, and with good reason. This probably would have worked, but sadly it just wasn't to be. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.